there's obviously a lot of history here in those five areas that we're talking about. Are there any surprises or things that are generally not well known that surfaced from this research?
I mean, there's a lot. First there's a lot that's bleak, and then there's some that's like potentially hopeful. When we looked at the healthcare inequality, there were these persistent gaps in longevity, persistent gaps in access. Uh, you know, Even when there were innovations in healthcare, the pattern was that they would not be applied equally, and that communities of color were constantly lagging behind in terms of healthcare access. In education, we saw segregation and the durability of segregation, the way that it has remained a problematic element of American society. That said, there were moments where schools were generally less segregated than they are now. And one of the interesting findings from the economics report was that, there had been this huge gap, and I mean, still is a persistent gap in wealth, and a persistent gap in earnings between black and white, and divided along stratified along racial lines and ethnic lines. But if you were to look at the time period from 1950 to 1970, you had a pretty significant convergence, and
Really?
which was due to lots of different things, but it was less of a pronounced gap between black and white labor, back at white wage earners. And one of the other things that report pointed out was that in the past 8 to 10 years, because of the tight labor market, low income workers who are disproportionately black have also disproportionately benefited from rising wages. And so there are some elements in there that point to things that we could think about and say, how do we replicate this at scale? Or how do we continue these trends? And then also, one of the objectives was to look at the things that we've gotten wrong and say, how do we navigate past reiterating those mistakes?
Yeah.